Hello! For my first video in this style, let me venture into basically a dead topic to share my 2 cents. Or 5 cents, adjusted for inflation, and the recent news that the USA doesn't make pennies anymore. I've always been firmly on the games are art team. Games, after all, feature music that has to be composed, performed, recorded, and mixed, images that must be drawn, modeled, photographed, narratives, dialogue, and flavor text that have to be written and edited. Most crucially, all these things have to be curated by a singular creative vision that delivers them on a platform of code that makes the entire thing interactive. Interactivity is the thing that elevates games from merely being a collage of other art forms into an art form unto itself. Personally, I think there's something poetic about how each new art form mankind creates encapsulates the older art forms as you move forward in time. Art started as cave paintings with no words and live performances around campfires, to formal paintings, theater, and the novel, which put storytelling into print so that more complicated performances could be planned and executed, more complex narratives than what would be reasonable to expect an actor to keep in their head at once. Next came films and comics, which, in my humble opinion, co-invented what we today call cinematography, because blocking and composition on the page and on the screen are crafts unto themselves. Now, art was big enough that teams of people worked for months to get just the right version of every scene and line of dialogue recorded and delivered in a neat package that makes it all seem effortless, even though we all know it's not. Now, humanity's creative traditions have converged and been revolutionized by interactivity, which, in a manner of speaking, reintroduces the live performance aspect of our most ancient art forms into ones that had been, for centuries, just pre-recorded. Games as a medium go as far back as, like, the 1960s, with the early experiments in interactive gaming. Some of those very early games barely having graphics. Many of these efforts were experiments by programmers, but they had their audiences. As a commercial industry, games only really took off in the 1970s, mostly under Atari's wings. And, at least in the USA, games promptly crashed in 1983, also under Atari's wings. But the medium endured, in Japan, in Europe, and in America as computer games, as distinguished from console and arcade games. They endured, and hobbyist designers like Richard Garriott and Ken and Roberta Williams were able to launch companies before the crash that grew and were able to be big enough to survive it. All these artistic movements spawn their own unique cultures of game developers inspiring each other with this sort of pseudo-hereditary lineage of influence that birthed most of gaming's classic works and carries forward to this day. The tragedy of their success is that eventually they were successful enough to become the establishment, or to be consumed by it. In 1996, Sierra Online was acquired for the first time. Garriott's Origin System suffered the same fate back in 1992. And so the 90s and 2000s belonged to corporate developers who saw the lesson of the crash as being to carefully quality control their releases. At least they did for a while. But the hobbyists still existed. They were just largely irrelevant to an industry that had passed them by and become something more concrete, more establishment. I mean, this was my childhood era, and to be honest, even the indie scene was very derivative. I cannot tell you how many hours I spent on Mario World ROM hacks that just give Mario a gun or put blood everywhere. But hey, modding and hacking and flash parodies of Nef's games and Sonic were what the indie scene was like in 2002, at least as far as I can remember. So the hobbyist scene at this time was very underground, very derivative, very much, kids fooling around on their computer. Which, hey, there's a long tradition of that. Nothing wrong with kids having a hobby. But in a weird way, their underground status and the fact that they were so derivative and tightly connected to the establishment of the gaming industry put them in a good position to take advantage of what would happen next. In 2006, Nintendo released their Wii, and it was marketed directly to people who didn't traditionally play games. I remember both advertisements and human interest news stories about putting them in nursing homes. Of course, that means that the most successful game was the Wii Sports that shipped with the console. But at the same time, Microsoft launched the Xbox Live Arcade in 2004. Apple released the first iPhone in 2008. That's contemporaneous the iOS App Store, which was a place where you could sell games. Independent developers, who had always existed, of course, suddenly had their choice of storefronts to release their own titles, often with minimal oversight from any publisher at all. The result was a lot of slop. But it also came with a lot of good shit. I consider this to be the first indie renaissance. Now that mainstream successes like Halo and Call of Duty had expanded the scope of who played games, those same people could now be potentially an audience for independent developers with a wild idea and enough gumption to get it made to potentially expand the breadth and variety of games. Lots of cool stuff came out in this era, along with lots of weird stuff that I adore for its weirdness. I think the coda on this era of the indie renaissance was when people from the AAA industry started to go indie. Chris Roberts founding Cloud Imperium in 2012 to make Star Citizen, which still hasn't come out. Inafune going indie for Mighty No. 9 in 2013. Steve Males, Chris Sutherland et al. Going indie as Playtonic in 2014. This brain drain from the AAA industry was the acknowledgement from within that the current landscape was no longer sustainable, and indie seemed like the viable alternative. Now, you might hear everything I've said so far and think, hold on, are there really people who think games aren't art? And the answer is yes. While today those people are mostly corporate suits who think any slop they serve will sell if it has the right brands on it, and cite quarterly revenue targets to justify forcing all games to become unfocused messes of every idea the company has ever programmed to maximize unit sales. Hey, anybody remember when Far Cry and Assassin's Creed weren't just the same game with a different setting? I do. Thanks to outsourcing, they now also have to make enough revenue to pay the salaries of entire studios' worth of mercenary developers, and games are taking so long to make that Duke Nukem Forever's 14-year-long development hell is no longer an outlier. How much do you think it costs to pay 100 salaries for 10 years? If we assume that the average member of the dev team is paid $80K a year, and some are paid much more, that's $80 million per year for a team of just 100 people. According to just one Google search, Epic Games employs 4,600 people in 2025. That's just salaries, because you have to also pay for all those employees to have computers, the software licenses they need to do their jobs, desks to sit at, and so on. Point is that people at the head of these companies don't see games as art because they see the huge amount of red that they must overcome just to report a single dollar of profit, which is what they want to be able to report in their regular conference calls with investors, who, if it is even possible, give even less of a fuck about games as art. These investors just want their overall stock portfolio to go up as of 3 months ago, and hey, McDonald's never has a problem recording profits. Ironically, the AAA devs who jumped ship were right. The current model was unsustainable, entirely as a result of investor incentives. But the alternative was to be consolidation and monetization. First, companies gobbled each other up, long-running series vanished, whole genres were regarded as dead because they were too niche to sell 20 million units. Even successful genres like soccer simulators were infested with DLC and loot boxes, so that the game could become a vestigial component of an unregulated gambling simulator. Because that's where the real money is, and you don't need that much game to sell the e-casino. Lesson here is to never sell your company. Public trading is a deal with the devil that forces you to seek mediocrity just to survive. Because one bad release means your entire company is fired and all your creations get added to the horde of IPs that increasingly monolithic publishers own and never make new titles for. But all of that is a modern evil, and it deserves its own video that I'm kind of still writing. Apologies. Consider that a teaser. My actual subject is the largely dead topic of people discounting games as art because they were too film-brained to grasp that the gameplay is the art form. About 10 years ago, we saw some folks conclude that what games really needed to, quote-unquote, become art is to not have any gameplay, in order to be more like movies. Hence the walking simulator. Games that were, in essence, just movies that you have to do the camera work for. What Remains of Edith Finch, Gone Home, Firewatch, The Beginner's Guide, and The Stanley Parable, all of these games got celebrated for, quote-unquote, advancing games as a medium, by removing most of the gameplay. Choosing instead a narrative that was often emotionally poignant and usually featured voice acting, sometimes celebrity voice acting. Sometimes the celebrity voice acting was a major part of the marketing, which feels like a waste of money to me, but hey, you do you, boo. I feel like the definitive take on this era was the parody game, The Museum of Dead Wifery, which literally just mocks the idea that games never had emotionally storytelling before. But I get it. If you're a 3D animation student graduating in 2015, you probably do not have the resources to make the next Devil May Cry. But you can probably make the next Indigo Prophecy if you lean on asset stores for most of your graphics, and dead family members for your cheap pathos. My hot take, however, is that these totally count as games. It actually is a unique and interesting gameplay flavor to make the player a passive spectator on some scripted, rather than simulated reality, that they can experience at their own pace. My disagreement with the zeitgeist of about 10 years ago is that they weren't needed to elevate games as a medium to the status of being art. In fact, they really didn't do anything new. Sierra published an entire catalog of classic story-focused adventure games in the 1990s. Gaming had been a storytelling medium since Zork. Really, all they did was remove the puzzle elements from adventure games altogether to focus on the storytelling even more. And you know what? That's good. That's perfectly fine. When making a game, you're essentially making a representative illusion of the spaces you're showing and a simplified simulation of what real-world mechanics you want to represent in gameplay. If all you want to do is convey vibes, emotion, a story, an aesthetic told through music, sound effects, and graphics, with very little in the way of puzzles or obstacles, that's completely legitimate. I don't discount walking sims as games for not having leveling systems any more than I discount poetry as literature for often not having any named characters. What I'm saying is that Kitty Horror Show is the Robert Frost of indie games. What started first with the emergence of the indie game in the 2010s and was accelerated by the enshittification of AAA games during the 20-teens and the pandemic, we have seen passionate and creative people ask hard questions about how much gameplay you really need for their games. Not how much gameplay you need to meet some threshold definition of video game, but how much their specific game needs. If it doesn't need to be there, leave it out. Don't put effort into including extraneous detail if it's extraneous. This pandemic-era resurgence of creativity is what I'm calling the second indie renaissance. There's a YouTuber named Annie Austin who has a series of videos looking way too close to the 3D environments that we play through in games. In my favorite episode of the series, on Zelda Ocarina of Time, he makes the following observation, quote, "There's no reason to ever come to this spot. This space only exists as a consequence of other stuff they wanted to make. It's a space between the cracks." End quote. Because in 3D games, you have to close up the map in such a way that it feels like a real space and the player doesn't fall out of the world into the skybox, you end up with these, well, it has to be there type places. Oftentimes these places of no real significance end up giving a very raw look at the development process that I personally find fascinating. When we are making games, we have to choose what we include. In a way, this is the reason why so many modern AAA titles feel so bad to play. They're unfocused. They're putting too much time and effort and energy into making a detailed and realistic world and neglecting the essential creative opportunity to narrow their scope and focus on one or two things that could actually convey a focused point. It would be laborious and annoying to try to read a novel if the author felt they had to include in the dictionary definition of every single word longer than 5 letters, in line, in the text, in the way of the story. And that's what it feels like to play a game that has 300 gigabytes of textures and uncompressed audio that isn't even fun. To do one or two things well, a narrow and deliberately curated scope, that's what results in classics. I don't think Ocarina of Time would be improved by a hunger system, but The Long Dark absolutely would be worse off if you removed it. Each of these games focused on what matters to the creative vision that it set out to achieve, and there are still people who play out of Ocarina of Time and love it today, even though the entire game has fewer triangles than one modern hero shooter's random character's ass cheek. The emergence of the indie gaming space, of specifically the PSX, PS1, N64, Dreamcast, low-poly aesthetic is, in my humble opinion, 100 artists realizing this at the same time I started to. Some of these titles are so directly inspired by specific works from that era that they really do seem like the equivalent of tribute bands. I'm thinking of like Psilocybin and Heartworm for examples of that. But other people are doing really neat stuff with the permission to have characters that are less than 200,000 tries on them. Crow Country, for example, is not just a Resident Evil-inspired game. It is its own title. It is ascended beyond simply appealing to the retro sensibilities. Personally, I adore the PS1 aesthetic. Not out of nostalgia, because I never owned a PS1. I didn't play a single PS1 game until I was in high school and got a copy of Final Fantasy IX that I played on my PS2. I adore the aesthetic because it comes from the creative answers that artists have to make, given the limitations that they are now imposing on themselves. It's not being imposed by hardware limitations, it's being imposed creatively by the artists themselves. It's like if you challenged yourself to paint a picture using only shades of green. A lot of people who've taken inspiration from the games coming out that are going for that PSX low-poly aesthetic are really leaning into the look and the feel and the vibes of that era. And with that as their creative focus, it's no wonder that a lot of them tend to make walking simulators. Many are ones that I really like. Nothing was more revolting to me in art than something that defers to established formula without consideration for why that formula exists, what its creative intentions are. It's one step removed from the cargo cult you see in AAA, where you're expected to pay more money for thinner gruel just because an asset management firm killed and skinned a brand you used to love and is expecting you to treat them wearing said skin suit with the same adoration. Thank God we have all these indies doing their own weird shit. It's only possible for solo devs if they just remove shit from the game that isn't relative to their creative goals. I don't really have a conclusion to this barely scripted ramble, so I'll just recommend some cool indie games that fit the vibe of low-poly walking sim that you would enjoy if you share my weird taste. You'll find them linked in the description. Thank you for listening, if indeed you are still here. Have a good day, everyone. I have to figure out how to get out of here. That door's not even real. Doesn't go anywhere. Hey, thanks again for listening to this messy first video of mine. I learned a lot making it, so hopefully future upcoming videos will feature better animation and stuff like that. By all means, please leave any critique in the comment section. I would love to have some feedback, especially if you're more experienced with Blender than I am. Thanks again. Goodbye.